Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 4th of May 2022. In Brisbane, it is humid today, but it is a wonderful day out there. It's not very sunny or neither too cloudy either as well. So let's get on with the news for today, because we have the two segments. We have our news right now, and then we have the real estate updates with Usa Chandra at 10 a.m. Let's get the headlines for today.
Millions of Australians will be paying more for their homes within days, with all four big banks now confirming they'll pass on the Reserve Bank's interest rate hike. The RBA lifted cash rates by 1/4 of a percentage point, the first rise in more than 10 years, with Governor Philip Lowe warning more are on the way. The mid-election rate rise on the back of record inflation data will make cost of living the crucial battleground of the campaign. Teachers across New South Wales will walk off the job this morning despite a last-ditch effort by the state government to placate unions. Some public schools will be closed today, while others will stay open with minimal supervision. State Education Minister Sarah Mitchell says the strikes will be disruptive.
We want our children in the classroom. We want to continue negotiating in good faith. And so I hope that we will be able to land a fair and a reasonable outcome and not see this level of disruption for our students and their families.
And overseas, demonstrations have continued outside the US Supreme Court after a leaked document suggested it may overturn a ruling that legalised abortion nationally. The draft opinion says Roe v Wade, a landmark decision dating back to the 1970s, was based on exceptionally weak reasoning. Its reversal would return abortion laws to the states. At least 13 have trigger laws which would automatically ban it following the Supreme Court decision.
What are the key news for today? Well, of course, as we know that the main news that everyone's been following, after 10 years today is the first time the interest rate has risen.
Jason Andrew is one of many homeowners who are now facing rising mortgage repayments.
It does certainly create some uncertainty and potentially some anxiety for us. We're probably the first generation that hasn't seen real interest rates increase.
Jason and his partner are on a variable mortgage, and a rate hike comes as they prepare for parenthood.
We're into that new phase of life where we have additional costs as well, so it's interest rate rises combined with childcare fees, school fees.
The Reserve Bank hasn't raised the cash rate in more than a decade. It's been at a record low of almost 0% during the pandemic, and now it's going up to 0.35%.
It's not unreasonable to expect that interest rates would get back to 2.5%.
The RBA governor says the board had to act to try to get inflation under control, which he says will stay for a while.
Our central forecast, which is that underlying inflation will decline to the top of the target band in 2024.
Prices are surging on everything from food to fuel through to building new homes. Economists say with inflation above 5%, the board made the right call.
What this does is it slows down the spiral effect where lots of people buy stuff at the same time, and then that stuff gets much more expensive over time.
Adelaide Timbrell expects the RBA to hike rates consecutively in the coming months.
So we think that by the end of this year, the cash rate will go from its current 0.35 to 1.25. And then by May next year, we'll see it go up even more to 2.25%.
The initial hit to borrowers will vary. It will all depend on whether your bank passes on the full rate hike to you. The rate rise will add $78 a month to an average mortgage on a variable rate. This will soar to $615 a month this time next year if the cash rate hits 2%. Those with bigger variable loans will be hit even harder, including Bashir Naim, who's building a new home for his family.
With the last few years, all you hear about is, rates dropping and the government encouraging, people to buy and the housing market booming, and now it's sort of the opposite. From our point of view, with the cost of building being very high, it hasn't come at a good time, I suppose.
Many Australians, like first home buyer Kelly Lehman, fixed their home loans during the pandemic.
With the market the way it is, it was just sort of inevitable, and I was trying to scrounge as quickly as possible to refinance.
Her repayments will stay low for now, but she faces a much higher rate when her deal ends.
I can definitely see that being an issue coming, the end of my 2-year stint of being locked in.
Not everybody's unhappy about the Reserve Bank's decision. Savers have been waiting a long time for this moment.
Oh, I want them to go up over 20%, like they did 3 times in the 1980s.
With deposit rates so low, Grant Agnew's nest egg has been doing little in the bank.
There has been cash coming in, but a minimal amount. It's been very difficult.
For the next generation, the purse strings are also tightening.
Well, it had to happen, and it has happened. So we will be following that up, and in next week's real estate update will bring a lot of insight into that. Well, right now, the next news is around housing as well, but this is about unsustainable homes and climate change altogether. So what is happening in that scene?
Months after Lorraine Orman's home was flooded in Goodna, southwest of Brisbane, she's still living in a caravan in her front yard.
It went up to the windowsills, which meant we lost all the contents.
She had to give up flood insurance after major flooding in 2011 saw her premiums rise to around $10,000 a year.
We just can't afford it.
New projections suggest by 2030, 1 in 25 Australian homes could be uninsurable.
In some electorates, like the worst electorates of Nichols in Victoria, this is 1 in 4 homes.
Queensland is by far the most vulnerable, with 6.5% of properties projected to be effectively uninsurable by 2030. New South Wales is second with 3.3% of properties at risk, followed by South Australia with 3.2%. All up, more than 500,000 homes are expected to be at risk by 2030. It's mostly due to the effects of climate change on riverine flooding, but also on worse bushfires, storms and coastal inundation.
This is climate change playing out.
It's no surprise to the insurance industry.
The findings reinforce what insurers have been saying for a long time. And while I don't think anything's uninsurable, I think it could become very expensive.
We obviously need to act faster on climate change. We need to invest far more in adaptation.
The Climate Council has made the data available for the public. But it's too late for Lorraine, who'd like to see governments do more to protect homes from disasters.
It'd be nice to see some way of making these areas insurable. All of us are willing to pay insurance, we just can't afford the premiums as they are.
A problem many more of us will face in the coming years. Michael Slezak, ABC News.
And that is a sign of the times, and very, very hard to insure homes. And if they become unsustainable, climate change obviously has a role to play. But, it's something we might have to just live with because there's not a lot you can do about that. The environment, looking after the environment, keeping clean, all that we can do. Whatever we humans have created, we can. But on overall picture, the earth is not what it used to be. So it's evolving through that. Natural changes, climate changes, things change. So we need to just deal with the changes and adapt as best as we can. Right now, what are the Indigenous leaders calling for? They are calling for a referendum on the First Nations voice to the Parliament.
In May 2017, on Anunu country, came a moment that many Indigenous Australians will never forget.
The historic Indigenous Constitutional Convention reaches a critical point later today.
In order to have good policy and good laws enacted by the Parliament, Indigenous peoples need to have a say. We need our own national Indigenous voice.
After years of debate about the need for greater recognition and autonomy, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders reached a consensus at Uluru.
There has to be some really fundamental change in the relationship. Australia has to hear us, for goodness sake.
The fundamental change these leaders wanted would require a majority of Australians to vote at a referendum to establish an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
That was the smart thing about the Uluru Statement. It wasn't gifted to the politicians. It was gifted to every Australian to say, this is our message and we need you to walk with us.
It's fantastic to be here, to be a part of that.
Pitjantjatjara woman Sally Scales was at Uluru in 2017.
And then you've got your workspace here.
5 years on, she's still waiting to see the constitutional change that's at the heart of the Uluru Statement.
It's very disheartening to see that we're still here and then Aboriginal communities are used as just a can-kicking exercise.
It's not clear exactly what a voice to Parliament would look like or how many Indigenous people it could elect. It would have a huge task to distill the concerns of hundreds of nations and clans across Australia. But the same problems exist in almost every community, and after 13 years, just 3 of the 17 Closing the Gap targets are marked as on track, and targets to reduce Aboriginal suicide rates and child removals are going backwards.
Everything that we struggle with, everything that we try and achieve, all connects to the decisions made in Canberra by the federal government. All of these things are decided in Canberra with very little influence from Indigenous people.
What was proposed at Uluru was an advisory body to have much more influence on the legislation, programs and policies that shape the lives of Indigenous Australians.
It's very short on detail, but it is a very big idea.
Then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull rejected the call to enshrine a voice to Parliament in the Constitution.
I have to be honest with you about this. I don't think it's a good idea, and if it were put up in a referendum, it would go down in flames.
I want to go back to Tia. We're not automatically going to get government to be on side with anything when it comes to First Nations agendas. And then government saying, well, no, we don't want that right now. Oh, thank you, but we're going to go back and do a consultation again.
I want to thank you all for being here. It's tremendous.
2 years later, a proposal to hold a referendum to acknowledge Indigenous sovereignty and create a legislated voice to government and a truth-telling commission was presented to the new Prime Minister.
And each of those are separate pieces of work because they are critical in their own right.
In 2019, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, stressed the urgent need to deliver these reforms.
Well, it's got to be before the next election.
But that push for constitutional change has stalled, and the Coalition appears in no rush to hold a referendum. Last month, the authors of the Uluru Statement reunited in far north Queensland, calling for a referendum either in May next year or in January 2024.
When will we ever be ready? How long in history have we gone? How long have Indigenous people in this country said the same thing over and over and over?
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Now that an election is coming and we're saying we're ready, the work's done.
Labor says it will immediately begin working towards a referendum on a voice to Parliament if it wins the election.
Our Labor government will work with First Nations people to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
I would like to think that it would be an incredible nation-building moment. I think there's going to have to be a very good yes campaign. And of course, the question that we ask in the referendum is crucially important. But I am confident, absolutely confident, that if this referendum was put to the Australian public, it would be successful.
Where we have people...
Ken Wyatt declined 730's invitation for an interview.
We've been able to double funding.
On the campaign trail, Scott Morrison again refused to support the call for a referendum on a voice to Parliament.
Our policy is to build up a voice from the ground up, and that process is underway of building up local voices of Indigenous people and seeing that build up over time into higher levels.
If you are re-elected, will you commit to a referendum on the voice in the next term of Parliament?
Well, I've already answered that question one before. It's not our policy to have a referendum on the voice. So why would I be doing that?
The Coalition has pledged $31 million for dozens of new regional advisory bodies, which would be created by legislation without a referendum.
And it's great to be here virtually.
The Greens have also gone cold on a rush towards a referendum, arguing a national vote would be more successful if it followed a truth-telling and treaty process instead.
The really deeply held view from the Greens is that the best chance of all of the elements, including voice, succeeding from the Uluru Statement is to have that process of truth and treaty at least commenced first.
We don't want symbolism, we want substantive constitutional recognition. During that 3 days there was debate and discussion.
Former WARFI and ALP member Thomas Mayer has spent the past 5 years speaking to First Nations communities about the Uluru Statement's call for constitutional change.
There must be a structural and political problem here. You're not listening to us.
The Torres Strait Islander unionist and author has just been in Newcastle speaking to councillors and members of the local Gurukai committee.
Now, all those laws and policies that they make have continued to fail our people to this date.
Those gathered here say there's more work to be done to educate Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
And of course, there's more work to be done. And we all realize that the amount of work that really needs to be done, we've got the Reconciliation Week coming on as well, and Queensland Multicultural Council will be putting together a function in Queensland Parliament as well. And many times a lot of these issues are being addressed. But I think the sooner they get on with it, the better. We all have come from many different countries, and we call this country our home, and proudly so as well. So, when we can look after all our multicultural communities, the onus is on us to look after the Indigenous community as well. Well, right now, let's move on with this thing where a flawed strategy, Mike Cannon-Brookes takes aim at AGL demerger.
Mike Cannon-Brookes, welcome to The Business.
Thanks for having me.
Mike, you need to win over shareholders to block the demerger. How will you do that, and what case will you argue?
Look, I'm putting forward a pretty clear case for the positivity I feel. As a shareholder, I feel like AGL has a very bright future. As a company, given its assets, both grid and generation assets, its talent assets, etc. However, I think the demerger is a very flawed strategy. I think it's globally irresponsible. I think it is a very poor outcome for shareholders, and I'll be making that case. I think it's a very poor outcome for the workers and employees of AGL, and a poor outcome for Australia and the government ultimately.
Well, as you've just said there, you've described this demerger plan as globally irresponsible and flawed, and that it risks a terrible outcome for shareholders. But the AGL board, which is committed to the demerger deal, says the deal will ensure the value created through Australia's energy transition stays with shareholders. So who are shareholders to believe?
I think I own somewhere north of 11%, and the board owns somewhere close of 0.02%. So maybe that's some choice. Secondly, this is a board that's presided over a 70% decrease in shareholder value over the last 5 years. So as they haven't exactly covered themselves in glory, I'm quite happy to put my ideas into the theatre of ideas and have them sparred upon. But I certainly don't believe their demerger plans, no.
The Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, has repeatedly said that the early closure of coal-fired power stations will drive up prices. If the demerger doesn't go ahead, can you guarantee that your plan won't push electricity prices up?
Quite the opposite. I think the demerger plan will push energy prices up. I think it will increase grid instability. We've seen that just in the last few weeks as the price of coal and gas have risen. Everyone's bills have started to go up. And fossil fuel generating assets are more and more expensive continually. Secondly, we've seen Loy Yang a second unit is now out, right? And so the company has had a roughly $100 million write-down in profits or announcement of. And in a demerged state, it would be harder to keep the reliability of those assets going in the long term. So I think the demerger would result in higher prices, and less grid stability.
So why does keeping AGL as one company make it more resilient and able to reduce emissions faster?
Well, it's certainly able to manage the transition. So these plants are going to close. Everyone agrees on that. Question is how fast, and what we build is replacement capacity for those. Some part of that is related to the company's access to financing, access to talent. As a single larger entity, it has a much greater chance of having access to that financing at a lower rate, so it can manage that transition better. Secondly, the assets that are being split up here have some significant sense to be together. For example, the plants themselves have significant grid access, which is needed if you're going to build out large-scale renewable storage facilities, which are going to manage the huge influx of renewables that we already have coming into the grid in New South Wales and Victoria.
Do you think, Mike, it's easier now for you to achieve your goals as AGL's largest shareholder, just over 11%, rather than going down the takeover path of previous months, given the issues around the FIRB potentially blocking that deal in the national interest?
No, I don't think FIRB would have been an issue for that deal. I don't think it would have been a thing. I think it would have been, we could have achieved a better outcome through that option, but the board was very clear they did not wish to meaningfully engage and that was not an option. So we went back to the drawing board and came back. There's a very different approach to the company. We're saying, well, we're going to have to keep it together and solve the problem together with you. What we have done is put ourselves on the block. As the largest shareholder, we stand to benefit or lose alongside the shareholders, and it's a clear investment. That's very different. But the access to capital will be less in the demerged entity than in the current combined entity. It would have been better if we had gone private, because I think the access to capital would have been even better still. So
does that mean you won't try again with the takeover bid?
All I'm focused on at the moment is preventing the demerger, which I think is critically flawed and a horrible option for all the stakeholders. That's the first step. The board has clearly put that up as the choice before shareholders, and I'm trying to make sure that shareholders understand there are multiple choices here.
And finally, Mike, with the election campaign in full swing, we know there are many independents who are campaigning, particularly on climate. How big a threat are they for the incumbents?
Oh, that's a totally different question to the AGL demerger. Look, I think they have a lot of views that I agree with in different spots. I think what's interesting is that living kind of in two electorates with two different independents running and challenging the incumbent, they have actually quite different views. I think their views on climate in general and integrity in government are very important. I think they are challenging in those areas. I think this is what political discourse takes. There's lots of different views and people to make their choices with their votes. Same thing happening in the independents and those electorates as is happening in the AGL case. So hopefully a thoughtful discussion and then people make.
So there you go, ladies and gentlemen, the demerger discussion, which led into the political discussion. Of course, we know that there are a lot of independents have their own views, and climate change and energy is top on the agenda for all the ones. Well, right now, before we go to our Daily India report, let's take a look at that situation in Ukraine.
It wasn't long before Russia resumed its bombing of the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. There are still women and children trapped in bunkers beneath the vast plant, and Ukrainian troops making a last stand against the Russian forces surrounding them. A brief ceasefire has allowed more than 100 civilians to escape. They're safe, but they're traumatised.
There is no house anymore. All the time we spent in the bunker, they were bombing.
They'd been living underground for over 2 months.
Over 40 of us had only 6 tins of food. We boiled them into buckets of soup, and that was it.
Ukraine says Russia is again blocking humanitarian corridors out of the devastated city.
You wake up in the morning and you cry. You cry in the evening. Imagine, everything is destroyed. Everything is broken.
With Russia focused on gaining ground in the east and south, missiles have hit the Black Sea port of Odessa. A dormitory where civilians were sheltering underground was destroyed, killing a teenage boy. In the east, some of the vulnerable are being evacuated. This 95-year-old woman has made the heartbreaking decision to leave her home. Ukrainian forces have just recaptured this village near the Russian border, but this is unlikely to be the end of the battle. Nick Dole, ABC News, Dnipro.
So the situation doesn't seem to be improving there. Well, right now it's time to go to our daily India report.
Welcome to the Daily India Report that brings you reports, interviews, features and much more on India and the Indian diaspora. In our first story, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi landed in Germany on May 2nd on the first leg of his three-nation European tour. On the first day of his visit, Modi and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz co-chaired the 6th India-Germany Intergovernmental Consultations. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi held his first meeting with Olaf Scholz after Olaf assumed the office of German Chancellor in December 2021. The two leaders held a one-on-one discussion before holding delegation-level talks. India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar and National Security Advisor Ajit Doval were part of the Indian delegation. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said in Germany that no country can emerge victorious in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, underlining that India supports peace and made an appeal to end the war. Prime Minister Narendra Modi was accorded the Guard of Honor at the forecourt of the Federal Chancellery in Berlin.
यूक्रेन के संकट के आरंभ से ही हमने तुरंत युद्ध विराम का आह्वान किया और इस बात पर जोर दिया था कि विवाद को सुलझाने के लिए बातचीत ही एकमात्र उपाय है। हमारा मानना है कि इस युद्ध में कोई विजयी पार्टी नहीं होगी, सभी को नुकसान होगा। इसलिए हम शांति के पक्ष में हैं। यूक्रेन संघर्ष से उत्पन्न उथल-पुथल के कारण तेल की कीमतें आसमान छू रही हैं। विश्व में खाद्यान्न और फर्टिलाइजर की भी कमी हो रही है। इससे विश्व के हर परिवार पर बोझ पड़ा है, किंतु विकासशील और गरीब देशों पर इसका असर और गंभीर होगा।
Talking about the change that India has witnessed in the past 7 years during his interaction with Indian diaspora at the Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, PM Modi said that India has ended the politically unstable atmosphere of the last 3 decades by pressing a button.
सकारात्मक बदलाव और तेज विकास की आकांक्षा ही थी कि जिसके चलते 2014 में भारत की जनता ने पूर्ण बहुमत वाली सरकार चुनी और 30 साल के बाद ऐसा हुआ है।
The Prime Minister said his words include all the children of Maa Bharati who live in every corner of the world.
मन करता है कि जी भर के आप लोगों को करोड़ों करोड़ों हिंदुस्तानियों के सामर्थ्य की बात करूं, उनका गौरवगान करूं, उनके गीत गाऊं। और जब मैं कोटि कोटि हिंदुस्तानियों की बात करता हूं तो सिर्फ वो लोग नहीं जो वहां रहते हैं, वे लोग भी जो यहां रहते हैं।
India celebrates the Muslim religious festival of Eid. After 2 years of the pandemic, people gathered at the mosques and the markets. As Ramzan, the holy month of fasting, comes to an end, people across India are celebrating the auspicious occasion of Eid ul-Fitr on 3rd May 2022. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Kovind extended best wishes to the people on Eid ul-Fitr. After 2 years of restrained festivities due to COVID, gatherings were cited at the mosques and the markets. In many parts of the world, Eid was celebrated on Monday 2nd May. Ramadan is observed in the 9th month in the Islamic lunar calendar. The 10th month is Shawwal, whose first day is marked as the festival of Eid ul-Fitr. Big relief for the children in India aged 12 to 17 years now they can get the Serum Institute's coronavirus vaccine, Covovax, at private centers. As COVID cases rise in India, children aged 12 to 17 years will now be able to get a dosage of Covovax costing about Rs 1,000 in addition to a hospital service charge of Rs 150. Currently, children aged 12 to 14 years are vaccinated with biological ease intramuscular vaccine Corbevax, while those in the 15 to 18 years age group are being administered Bharat Biotech's Covaxin at government vaccination centers. India today reported 2,568 new COVID-19 cases, 18.6% lower than yesterday. It is to be noted that the Supreme Court of India, in its landmark judgment, has said that no one can be forced to take the vaccine. It also directed that the union government must publish reports of the adverse effects of the vaccination. With COVID cases relatively low, coupled with the tourism sector opening up, domestic air travel has gathered pace in India. Delhi was ranked the world's second busiest metro after USA's Atlanta in March 2022. India's capital city of New Delhi was ranked the world's second busiest for air travelers after USA's Atlanta in March 2022, according to a global travel data provider. Dubai Airport made way for Delhi for the second slot. Airlines operating at Delhi Airport flew around 3.6 million seats compared to 4.4 million used by airlines in Atlanta in USA. India's aviation market recovering and the government reopening international flights last month helped Delhi Airport climb. The rise in Delhi's rank is primarily due to the recovery in India's domestic travel market, which has recovered significantly.
The tourism industry was suffering because in 2019, ever since the closing of the borders and the closing of international flights, we really suffered. There was absolutely no business, and about 25 million people have lost their jobs. In 2019, India earned about $30 billion in foreign exchange from inbound tourism. And we are confident the way, the whole tourism industry has bounced back because people were frustrated staying at home for 2 years. And now they are, tourism has started with a revenge. We call it revenge tourism. So all flights, domestic as well as international, are full. And we are confident that if the fourth wave does not come and there are no government restrictions, we are confident that we will earn $35 billion to $40 billion in the next 2 years.
Unlike Delhi, other large airports in the region like Dubai and Changi primarily depend on international traffic, which is yet to recover and fully remove restrictions post 2 years of COVID-19. In case you're planning to travel via Mumbai Airport on May 10th, consider that the airport shall remain shut for 6 hours. The Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj International Airport, Mumbai, will remain shut for all flight operations for 6 hours on May 10 to carry out pre-monsoon maintenance and repairs. For this purpose, both runways shall be closed for all flight operations on May 10 between 11 am to 5 pm. All airlines have been informed that normal operations would resume that day after maintenance works on the 2 runways are completed at 5 pm. All passengers have been advised to check the May 10th flight schedules with their respective airlines to avoid any inconvenience. This will cheer up all the Bollywood's King Khan fans as Hollywood actor Benedict Cumberbatch has chosen Bollywood actor Shah Rukh Khan to be part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In a new interview,
and ladies and gentlemen, that's about all we have for you today in the Daily India Report. Right now, before we close off for today, let's take a look at all the functions and events taking place. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's about all we have for you in this segment. Don't forget that we are back at 10 a.m. With the weekly real estate update with Usa Chandra of GlobeNet Realty. Well, right now, the Queensland government is encouraging everyone to get your flu vaccinations before peak winter hits. So now is the time to get the vaccinations before it's too late. So until our next show, which is at 10 a.m., the real estate update with Usa Chandra, it's goodbye from us.